everyone, Trails Unpacked here. Today we're going to be tackling the topic of how to create a resupply plan. Making a resupply plan is something that a lot of people worry about when first starting a trail. When you're sitting around wondering what can you be doing to get ready for your trail time, it's easy to want to think through what am I going to do every single day. And honestly, it's just unrealistic to plan that way. Something we learned very quickly on trail is that planning goes resupply to resupply, which means 5 days to 5 days at most. Your sweet spot for a resupply is actually around 3 days, I would say, based on food weight. So, what does that look like? First, we're going to lead you through an example of how to plan your first resupply, because that is something you can plan prior to getting onto trail. Why? Because you need to know how much food to carry first starting. So, let's take a look at the FarOut app and see what we can do.
So in the FarOut app, I have the Southern California section of the Pacific Crest Trail pulled up. This is the example we're going to be working through for the first resupply on the PCT. So at the bottom down here, you can see the Mexico-US border, and what we're looking for is for our first town for resupply. One thing I will say is that finding towns to resupply at or knowing which towns are the most accessible or hiker friendly becomes easier the longer you're on trail because you'll hear a lot from word of mouth. Starting out, you don't really have that because you need to know how much food to bring with you on day one. However, there are a lot of resources online and you can see recommendations. The first spot that we resupplied at was Julian. That's the first major town. There are smaller stops along the way that we'll look at that are basically just small general stores. So, starting out looking at the app, how do you find what a town is and what is a good resupply point? I have it zoomed out pretty far here so you can see the red line of the trail and then you can kind of see what juts off of it. And the first thing that sticks out is up here is this purple icon with a building, and that is the town symbol. Another way that you can find them is if you click the three lines in the upper left hand side and go to list. You can search for waypoints by type. So you can see towns and services specifically and see what they have listed here as different towns. You can also obviously just zoom in and follow it up and see what is there. So I'm qualifying Julian as a town because there are more amenities there than just one store, although you will many times run into towns that are one singular store. Um, Julian has restaurants, it has hotels, it has places to resupply, it has a gear store, so it is a little bit more of a larger town. So there are two things that I do when I've decided that this is a town that I potentially would like to resupply at. And the first thing that I do is I check and see what is in that town, what is available. And one of the best ways to do that is to utilize the waypoints marking the town. There is always a waypoint for the entire town, and that is that icon that I talked about. And then there will be subsequent icons for specific places in that town. One thing to note is that FarOut does not have a waypoint for every single business in a town, and so certainly here you can see that the two general store slash grocery stores in Julian do not have their own waypoints in FarOut. So always check Google if you really want to see what is the full scope of things in a town. So if you click the town icon, um, you can even see a short little note about it, all of the amenities it has, and then comments here. And I find the comments to be very helpful. It can be hard on FarOut, and you'll see when you're hiking knowing where to put your comment. And so I think a lot of comments end up on the town itself that might refer to specific businesses, to getting into the town, that kind of thing. So it's always a good idea to start with checking the comments on the town as a whole and then narrowing it down from there if you want to check specifically the post office or one of the gear stores or that. So after I do that and kind of suss out what the resupply options are, does this look like a good resupply point? The next thing I want to do is check, how do I get into this town? And because of the way I have my map set up on satellite, it can be hard to see. There are other map versions you can have on FarOut. But what I'm looking for are roads. There are no blue blazes going into Julian, and the blue blaze typically just signals it's something you could potentially hike. And so that means that this is a road, a hitching dependent town. And there are two roads. One is this one right here, and then one is to the south. And so what I do when I'm looking for which one could get in, and honestly, sometimes there are multiple ways to get into a town, so you just have to make the judgment of what you would like. But one of the great things about Far Out is you can see what people recommend, which way you do. So I'm following that road over to the red line, and there are waypoints here for the road crossing. If I click the road crossing, in the about, I can get, just a quick, what road is this, how big is it? And it even says here, hikers often hitch from here. And then the comments, which are, always going to be the gold that you're looking for. Other people are phenomenal about talking about if this is a good hitching point, if it's not a good hitching point, if trail angels pick up here, if shuttles pick up here. So you can very easily get a good sense of if there's a recommended area or a road or a way to get into a town, that's the way that you want to go. So Scissors Crossing is the most popular route for getting into Julian, and that's the one that I'm going to use. And so what I'm going to note here is that Scissors Crossing is at mile 77.3. So for my first resupply, I am going from mile 0 at the border to mile 77.3 to get into Julian.
Now that we know the miles in between our starting point and our next town point, what we have to decide is how many days are we going to carry for. And there are two different ways to do this. One way is to do it by taking an average of how far you think you're going to hike. For example, in this one, we have 77.3. So we're going to say, I think that I'm going to hike an average of 10 miles a day. So what does that put us at? You can go another option of trying to plan out how much you think you're going to hike day to day. Now, your preference for these two options might change the further you get on trail. When you are, let's say, 3 weeks into trail, you're going to have a much better idea of your hiking speed and your consistency across terrains. So you might lean towards option one further down trail. First starting out, though, it's hard to know how you might hike consistently over numerous days. So for your peace of mind, you might want to stick with option two, getting started.
So let's dive into option 2, finding our camp spots. A way that you can do this is we're going to follow the red line up and look for those camping icons. When you click on them, it will tell you how far those miles are. Another option, and honestly the one that I prefer, is to use the list format because it gives you the mile numbers right there. So if I'm saying, okay, on my first day, I am going to aim for 10 miles, I can scroll down to around the 10-mile mark and see what my options are. As a note, and one thing that you'll become more familiar with the more you use FarOut, is that not all campsites are marked with a tent icon. Traditionally, people will list good other tenting sites under other waypoints, such as the dirt road crossing, pipe gate, things like that. I mean, honestly, dirt road crossings mean flat ground, so almost always there is camping within 0.1 on either way of it, and people will make notes of that. So just keep that in mind if you are kind of seeing an area where there's no camping icons. So I'm aiming for about 10 miles, and I see based on the 10 site options, I have one at 7.4 and one at 11.4. I'm going to stay conservative and say I'm aiming for the 7.4 on my first day. So let's make a note of that. Day 1, 7.4. The next day, how many miles do I think that I can achieve? I think that I'm going to aim to do about 13 miles. I'll have the full day. I can get started a lot earlier than I did on my first day. That's going to put me close to mile 20, which is actually perfect because then I'm going to end up at the Lake Morena County Park, which is also by the malt shop. A great stop if anyone wants to treat themselves, burgers, fresh food, milkshakes. You get the picture. So let's make a note of that. Day 2, mile 20. Now, my next day, I did 13 on day 2. I'm going to aim for maybe 15 on day 3. So that's going to put me around mile 35. I'm going to scroll down and let's see what I can see around here. And it looks like there's a plethora of options between mile 32 and 36 mark. So maybe I'm going to aim for mile 34. That would put me at about 14 miles. Again, you don't have to use this list format to do it. You can absolutely do it based on the map view and clicking the tent sites. It can be easier to read comments that way. The list view, that is one drawback of it, is that you can't necessarily read the comments as well. So now I have my first 3 days, and I need to populate this now all through mile 77.3. Let's do that really quickly. Now I can see how many days I think that I will make to get to Julian for my first resupply.
Now that we've learned how to plan your first resupply, I want to give you some tips of how to plan all of your resupplies across the trail. These are just some things that we've picked up across our 2 thru hikes that have really helped us hone in on creating the perfect resupply plan. Our first resupply tip is keeping in mind how many days of food that you want to carry. On average, 1 day's worth of food is 2 pounds, which means 5 days is about the max that you want to have on you at one time. That is 10 pounds total of extra weight just in food. Now, there are definitely times where you're going to have to carry more than 5 days, and definitely in the example that we just went over with Julian, you're looking at more than 5 days depending on your miles. The one thing we just want to caution is that sometimes the discomfort of carrying more days of food is greater than the discomfort of hiking a few more miles every day to bring down the amount of days in between resupplies. Our next tip, as I mentioned in the beginning, is don't stress trying to plan everything too far out. I highly, highly, highly recommend planning it resupply to resupply and not entering the trail with a full plan, because chances are that's not going to be the plan you're able to follow, and it's just going to be more stressful trying to stick to a plan. Our third tip is to factor in town meals into your plan. So in the examples that we went over, it's not even days. You're not doing a resupply in 5 days even, in 6 days even, in 4 days even. You're coming in midday, and that means town food. If you're going to take 4.5 days to get to a town, that means you're probably going to be in that town by lunchtime. No use carrying the extra weight of a lunch or even a dinner into that town into that day. So when you're calculating your resupplies, pay attention to those decimal points, because you can factor in carrying less food and having better food in town. And our last tip is count the blue blazes into your miles totals. In the example that we worked through, it was a hitch in, so you're not adding any extra miles. But especially on the Pacific Crest Trail, there are many times where you have to hike out to a trailhead, or you might have to hike down the road where getting a hitch isn't so easy. So remember to count those blue blaze miles in, because they can be substantial in some points. And finally, check out trailsunpacked.com for more info and even some fun recipes of how to spice up your resupply. Thanks for watching.